Yes, the boys and the girls, the guys and the gals. I'm currently in Uttoxeter because last week someone chucked a coffee into my Buy Me a Coffee fund and said, have you got anything on Uttoxeter? So I thought, you know what, I'll go and spend the day there. I've got 3 or 4 videos that are going to be coming out over the next couple of weeks, but this one will be out obviously tonight. So, without further ado, let's get bloody into it.
Samuel Johnson's one of those names that travelled far beyond Staffordshire. But the story that brings him back to Uttoxeter's not really about fame. It's not about a great writer being remembered by history. It's about something smaller, quieter and much harder to shake. It's about a son who once refused his father and a feeling of guilt that seems to have followed him for the rest of his life. Johnson was born in Lichfield in 1709, inside a family where books were part of everyday life. His father, Michael Johnson, made his living as a bookseller, and that meant the family business did not end in the doorway of the shop. Michael's work took him beyond Lichfield into nearby towns where he could sell to people who may never have made the journey to him. One of those towns was Uttoxeter. Long before Samuel Johnson became a famous name, his father was making his way here with books to sell. You can imagine him arriving in the market, setting himself up among other traders, and hoping the day would be worth the journey. He wasn't a character in a big story back then. He was a working man, trying to keep his business alive and provide for his family. At some point, when Samuel Johnson was still a young man, his father asked him to come to Uttoxeter and help him in the stall. It sounds like a simple request, and perhaps at the time it felt like nothing more than that. A father needed help from his son. The journey had to be made and the stall had to be attended. But Samuel refused. Years later, when Johnson spoke about that moment, he didn't give himself much of an easy excuse. He didn't blame confusion, bad luck, or some harmless misunderstanding. He said that the fault had been pride, and that word makes the story feel heavier. It suggests that when his father needed him, Johnson thought too much of himself and too little of the man who was asking. Perhaps he was embarrassed by the work, or perhaps he didn't want to be seen standing in the market stall. Or maybe he was just young enough to believe that one refusal would not matter very much. Whatever was in his mind that day, the result was the same. His father asked him to come to Uttoxeter, and Samuel Johnson just wouldn't go. To anyone else, it might have just looked like a small family disagreement. A young man being stubborn, a father and son rubbing against each other in the way families often do. Nothing about it would have seemed important enough to become part of history. But Johnson remembered it. What makes the story so human is that some regrets don't feel dramatic when they first happen. They enter life quietly, almost disguised as ordinary moments. And only later do they become difficult to carry. You look back and realise that someone needed you, and you weren't there. You realise that pride had spoken before kindness had a chance. Now, Michael Johnson died in 1731 when Samuel was still only in his early 20s. Once his father had gone, that old refusal could no longer be repaired in the same way. There was no chance to stand beside him at that stall. There was no chance to make the journey together. And there was no chance to say sorry while his father was still alive to hear it. And that's where this story becomes more than just a local anecdote. It becomes a story about a strange power of memory. Johnson spent his life with words, but words couldn't carry him back to that day. He could confess what he'd done, and for that he could judge himself. But he could not return to the younger man and choose differently. Around 50 years later, Johnson came back to Uttoxeter, and by then he was no longer simply Michael Johnson's son from Lichfield. His life had carried him into a much wider world, and his name had become known far beyond places he'd grown up in. But none of that seems to have removed the memory from his father's stall. Whatever he'd become, this old moment still had a claim on him. According to the account told by James Boswell, Johnson returned to the marketplace and stood on the spot where his father's stall had once been. He stood bareheaded in bad weather, treating the act as penance for the way that he'd once refused his father. And that's the image at the heart of this whole story. An older man standing in the rain with his head uncovered in the middle of Uttoxeter Market Place. He was not there because anyone had forced him to come. And he wasn't there because the act could change anything in a practical sense. His father was long dead, and the missed duty belonged to a day that could never be recovered. But Johnson came anyway. He came because in his own mind something still had to be answered for. He couldn't help his father at the stall when help was asked of him, so years later he placed himself where the stall had stood. He couldn't undo the refusal, so he returned to the place where refusal had led. He couldn't speak to his dad as a living man, so he faced the memory instead. A later version of the story gives the scene even more public detail. It says Johnson came into the marketplace at a busy time, removed his hat and stood there while people looked on. It's difficult to know whether every part of that later telling is exact. Johnson returned to Uttoxeter because he believed he owed his father a penance. There is something powerful about that, because the act itself was so simple. He didn't build a monument to himself, he didn't make a grand display of learning, and he didn't answer guilt with a clever language. He stood still, in the weather on a piece of Staffordshire ground that had become to mean something painful to him. And that's why Uttoxeter Market Place matters in the Johnson story. Today the conduit covers a relief showing Johnson's penance, and the place is traditionally connected with Michael Johnson's old bookstall. The exact position of the stall cannot be proved down to the inch, but the tradition of the conduit standing in the position of the stall has lasted because the story itself has meaning. It's not just a story about where a famous man once stood, it's a story about why he stood there. Johnson's father can easily disappear into the background if the story is only told through the fame of his son, but Michael Johnson matters here. He was the man who worked with books before Samuel Johnson became known for them. He was the father whose trade helped shape the world his son grew up in. He was the man who had once asked for help and didn't receive it. This was not only a son refusing a small task, it was a son refusing the man whose labour had helped him build a life he later became known for. Johnson seemed to have understood that later, or at least he felt it deeply enough to return. The famous son came back to the place where the working father had stood, and the whole story turns on that quiet reversal. It's easy to turn Samuel Johnson into a statue. History often does that with people once they become famous enough. We remember the portraits, the reputation, and the clever things they did, and slowly the person underneath of all that begins to disappear. But this story brings Johnson back down to earth. It shows him not as a monument, but as a man with an old regret he could not put down. And that's why this story still works. You don't need to know everything about Johnson's writings to understand what happened here. You don't need to have read his dictionary or studied his life in detail. The feeling behind the story is plain enough. The father asked and the son refused. The father died and then the son remembered. Most people understand that. Most people have a small thing in their own life that grew larger with time. A moment that could have been kinder, or a time they could have helped. A conversation they should have had before it became impossible. That's why Johnson, standing in the rain, still feels moving after all these years. It's not only about him, it touches something much wider. You can stand in Uttoxeter Market Place today and imagine a very different town around you. The older market and the people moving through it, the sound of trade, and somewhere among it all, Michael Johnson with his books. He would not have known that his store would one day be remembered because of his son's guilt. He was simply there to work. Years later, Samuel Johnson returned to that same marketplace as an old man carrying the weight of a younger man's pride. He stood there bareheaded, exposed to the weather, because there was nothing else left that he could do. That's the part of the story I find hardest to shake. It was too late to help his father, and it was too late to undo the refusal. It was too late for the apology to be received in the ordinary way. But it was not too late for Johnson to admit, at least to himself, that he'd been wrong. There's not really an ending to this story. We don't know whether the penance gave Johnson any peace, and we don't know what he felt as he walked away from the market. We don't know whether the rain and the public shame made the guilt lighter, or whether the memory stayed with him anyway. What we do know is that he came here. He came back to Uttoxeter, to the place connected with his father's stall, and he treated that old refusal as something serious enough to answer for. In doing so, he gave this marketplace a story that had lasted for centuries. Samuel Johnson may belong to the wider world, but this part of him belongs here. In Uttoxeter Market Place, the famous name becomes human again. A proud young man became an old man seeking forgiveness. A father's ordinary working day became part of a much larger memory. And in the rain, on the spot where the bookstore was believed to have stood, Samuel Johnson gave Uttoxeter a story that is never quite let go.